William Kent Krueger can be found each morning here at the Java Train, a coffee shop in St. Paul. Known as the author of the Cork O'Connor mystery series, Krueger's complex characters and page-turning plots have landed him on the New York Times bestseller list 4 times. His most recent effort is a work of literary fiction entitled Ordinary Grace. William Kent Krueger is a northern neighbor.
One might assume that you're a Minnesotan, but you did not, in fact, grow up in Minnesota. Tell us about where you grew up, how you grew up.
Yeah, I'm not native to Minnesota. In truth, I have no place that I actually call home. I was a gypsy kid. When I was growing up, my family lived all over the place. I count all the places we lived, and every time I count, I come up with a different number because I can't quite remember them all, but a lot of places. I didn't move to Minnesota until I was actually 30 years old. And we came here so that my wife could go to the University of Minnesota Law School.
What was going on in your family that you were moving so much?
We were a very unpopular family. No. My father began as a high school English teacher. I was born in Torrington, Wyoming, and he was teaching school out there at that point in time. But he discovered fairly quickly that back in those days, you couldn't support a family on what you got paid as a high school English teacher. So he went to work for an oil company, Standard Oil of Ohio. And part of what they expected of rising young executives in the large corporations back then is that you transferred. You would establish yourself, you would learn something, and then you would move to another district. So that was my father. We went from Wyoming to Oklahoma to Texas to Ohio, and that's where he separated from the oil company. They saw things, their values were very different, worlds apart actually at that point. So he went back to teaching high school English. We moved out to Oregon. I spent my high school years in Oregon, and that's really where all of that came from. The truth is, I think my parents had gypsy blood in them. They just loved moving, and as children, all of us, my brothers and my sister and I, we loved moving. It was a wonderful challenge. The interesting thing is that the minute I set foot in Minnesota, I knew I'd found a home. I fell in love with this place, absolutely in love with this place. And I knew pretty early on that when I really got serious about writing, this was the place I was going to write about.
I was wondering if all that moving as a child in any way sort of shaped your vision as a writer.
I think absolutely it did. I had such a broad perspective of the kinds of ways people could live. I lived in small towns, I lived on farms, I lived in big cities. So I had that broad range of experience that then when I decided to finally write down the things that I thought I knew, it was easy for me to write about a small town, or it was easy for me to write about a city and how people respond to those different kinds of environments and how those environments shape people in very different ways.
What did you fall in love with here in Minnesota?
One of the first best decisions that my wife and I made after moving to Minnesota was to vacation up north. Everybody vacations up north in Minnesota. So we started going to a YMCA camp that was north of Ely, a place called Camp du Nord. Wonderful place, wonderful place. And it's literally across the road from the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness, a place I knew absolutely nothing, didn't even know it existed before I moved here. As soon as I discovered the BWCAW, I knew this is a place great stories could be written about. Once I took a look at really a good look at northern Minnesota, I took out a map, took a look up there, and one of the things I noticed is that the Ojibwe influence is ubiquitous. Lake names, river names, town names, road names, it's everywhere. And I realized you couldn't really set a story in northern Minnesota without somehow including the Ojibwe. And that excited me. When I sat down to write the Cork O'Connor novel and decided to make Cork part Ojibwe, because for a lot of reasons, one of which was Tony Hillerman, if viewers know his work, was a huge influence on me. Tony Hillerman was doing in southwestern United States what I wanted to do in northern Minnesota. So when I decided that I wanted to include the Ojibwe as an element of the novels, it was an exciting prospect because I knew absolutely nothing about them. I was a cultural anthropology major in college, so the idea of learning about a new culture was very intriguing. And so I began by doing what any good academic would do. I sat down and I began to read about the Ojibwe. I read everything I could get my hands on. And when I thought I had a pretty good grasp of the Ojibwe language and the Ojibwe culture, I sat down and I began to write my first novel in the Cork O'Connor series, Iron Lake.
Yeah. You had studied cultural anthropology. I want to ask you about Stanford. I know that you had a pretty formative experience there. Could you tell us what happened with your academic career?
Sure. I spent a year at Stanford, but only a year, because at the end of that year they kicked me out for what I realized were all the best of reasons. The spring of '70, readers might remember, Vietnam was just an enormous divisive issue in the country. It was in '69 as well. Kent State occurred in the spring of '70. Stanford was kind of in the forefront of all of that, and for this reason. There was an institution that Stanford had a significant relationship with. It was called the Stanford Research Institute. And at that point in time, its primary source of income was weapons research for the military. And there were a lot of us on campus who felt that was an inappropriate relationship for an institution like Stanford to have. So we petitioned the trustees to sever that relationship and the administration, and we marched and nobody listened to us. And so finally, in frustration, we decided it was time to really take some action. So we marched on the president's office and took over the administration building. He said, no problem, not going to give you any trouble. He told all the employees to vacate the building. They left. We occupied it. About 6 or 7 o'clock that evening, a band came in and we had a big dance there. And about midnight, the band packed up and left. And at 1 o'clock, the Stanford Riot Squad rolled in and swept us all up. I was on a full scholarship at that point, and as a result of that arrest and those activities, they yanked my scholarship, so I had to leave Stanford. But honestly, I've always been very proud of everything that led to that, and I found it always much more interesting to say I was kicked out of Stanford than that I graduated from there, you know?
Yeah. I know it's a long arc from your early intentions to be a writer to getting Iron Lake published. Talk about that journey and what you went through in developing as a writer.
I served a very long apprenticeship. The truth is I've always written. My father, the high school English teacher, gave me a love of language very early on. So I grew up with stories, and for whatever reason, I always wanted to be one of the storytellers. I spent a much too long a period of time trying to be Ernest Hemingway and trying to write the great American novel as Hemingway might have written it. What I was learning was how not to write a book. I was learning the writer I wasn't meant to be, and I still had to discover the writer that I could be. And once I gave up Hemingway and really made a decision that I was going to try to write popular fiction, when I made that decision, I kind of looked around to see what people were in fact reading. And they were reading mysteries. And I thought, okay, I'm going to try to write a mystery. Problem is that my father, the high school English teacher, had raised me on literature with a capital L, me and my sibs. So I didn't know anything about mysteries. And like a lot of people who've never read a mystery, I came to the genre with a lot of ill-conceived notions. What I discovered about mysteries when I really began to read them is that a lot of people complain that people who don't know mysteries often complain that mysteries are formulaic, which is untrue. There is no formula really to mysteries, but there is a structure. Mm-hmm. And I love the structure of a mystery because it gives me parameters in which to work, easy parameters. Structure of a mystery is very simple. It goes something like this. In the beginning of a mystery, something happens. Very often it's a crime. Usually it's a crime. Very often it's a murder. Investigation follows and answers are found. That's it. Something happens, investigation follows, and answers are found. What that does is it provides you as an author with a structure. But it's a very loose, flexible structure. And what I discovered was that within that structure, as a writer, I could do anything I wanted to do, you know? I have friends who are historians. They write historical novels. I have some funny friends. They write humorous mysteries. You know, these days you can get away with throwing vampires and werewolves into your mysteries if that's what you want to do. Mm-hmm. The point for me is that the reach of a mystery genre is so broad that it can embrace any interests that a writer or a reader might have. I think of it as a very egalitarian art form in that way, very broad reach in its appeal. So I sat down to write my first mystery, Iron Lake. Now, anybody who's taken a writing class knows that the first tenet they try to pound into your head when you're in a writing class is what? Write what you know. Write what you know. And so I thought, what is it that I know? After 40, I began this when I was essentially 40 years old. Mm-hmm. At 40 years of age, what is it that I know? I understand human nature, so I'm going to talk about human nature. I'm going to talk about human beings. That's going to be really important. Character. Character is going to be one of the anchors of what I do. And I knew home, Minnesota, this place that I had adopted as my homeland. So human nature and home. I thought I'm going to anchor everything I write about in Minnesota, and it's going to be about the people here. And out of that really grew Iron Lake and Cork's family and all of the interesting people that populate the novels across the course of, 15 now?
Which brings us to Ordinary Grace, your latest novel, which is a departure from the mysteries. Tell us what this means in your evolution as an author, what this book means to you.
First, it's a novel that's really written almost in two parts. First part sets up the family and the situation and the town and the relationships and the conflicts. Mm-hmm. Then what happens. Mm-hmm. And then it's a different kind of a novel after that. It's how do we respond? How do we move on in our lives once these horrible wounds are delivered to us as human beings, as families, as individuals. And you care about that because I spent the first half of the novel having you fall in love with Frank Drum and his brother Jake and the whole Drum family.
One way we could wrap this up is to ask you for your advice to budding novelists out there, budding writers. You must get a lot of questions about that. So what do you tell young folks to encourage them?
When I teach writing, one of the first things I talk to the class about is simply this. If you're here because you want to be a writer in order to get rich and famous, I can almost guarantee that you're going to be disappointed. But if you're here because writing is what you love to do, because writing is your passion, because you're following your heart, then I can almost guarantee an entirely different kind of experience for you. Because if you spend your life doing what you love, in the end, it's not going to matter whether you got rich or famous, because you spent your life following your passion. That said, what I really believe is that if you do that, and if you're persistent, persistence is important in this business, eventually you're going to discover the writer you were meant to be. You begin writing the kinds of things you were always meant to write, and that's what will eventually open the doors for you.
For more information about William Kent Krueger, you can visit his website. You can find Ordinary Grace, as well as his Cork O'Connor mystery series, in bookstores everywhere and on Amazon.com.